Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's session from the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. It's our 232nd session since we started doing this at around the time of the outbreak of the SARS-2 pandemic in 2020. Our guest today is Darrin Qualman. He's on the staff of the National Farmers Union. He is interested in the sustainability of farming and everything related to it. In particular, today is going to be discussing aspects of sustainable aviation fuel and related elements. And so the floor is over to you, Darren.
Thank you very much, Dave. I'm coming through clearly, am I?
Yes,
Okay, and you can see my slides.
you bet.
So, as Dave said, I'm the Director of Climate Crisis Policy and Action with the National Farmers Union, and my talk today is entitled Sustainable Aviation Fuel, Farmland, Biomass Demand, and Planetary Boundaries. So, just to give a sense of what I'm going to talk about today, sustainable aviation fuel is a global mega project to shift the fuel supply for flying from oil fields to farm fields. There's a lot of impacts. As a farm organization, we're quite focused on those on agriculture and land. It will affect many, many things, including fertilizer use and hence agricultural emissions, soil carbon levels and soil carbon sequestration. Indeed, we believe that should this go ahead, sustainable aviation fuel will be one of the primary forces changing and transforming and restructuring agriculture through the 21st century. I want to make the point today that SAF creates impossible demands for biomass, and these are just one of many sets of demands poised to be foisted upon our global farmland base, and trying to produce this much biomass for SAF, for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, for biomaterials to feed more people, etc., will exacerbate multiple breaches of planetary boundaries. So I'm going to cover a lot of ground today. Those interested in reviewing it or getting more detail, checking sources and citations, this is all excerpted from a paper, a report we did a few months ago called Sustainable Aviation Fuel, a critical analysis with a focus on agriculture, land, and food. That 70-page report is available on our website, nfu.ca. As I said, it's full of footnotes, but most important, it's full of quotes from industry officials, from executives at the airlines, at trade associations such as IATA, the International Association, the International Air Transport Association, etc. And much of what I'm going to say today is going to seem kind of like the SAF plan is really out there. But if you look at our report and look at the quotes from CEOs of airlines, energy companies, and trade associations, you'll see that they're saying more or less the same things we are, that this is a massive project requiring huge scale up and trillions of dollars, billions of tons of biomass, etc. So those quotes are well worth reading. They're in our report. So I'm going to start off by just explaining what sustainable aviation fuel is. It's a drop-in fuel. In practice, in aircraft, it functions much like current fossil fuels, Jet A. On a full life cycle analysis, many sustainable aviation fuels probably produce lower combustion emissions compared to fossil fuels. We won't get into the weeds regarding emissions and LCAs. It really is complex territory. But what I would say is that's not the most important part of this question. The emissions per ton of SAF versus per ton of fossil fuel Jet A, it's really not the important part. No matter what you believe about those emissions, whether you accept best case or whether you're very skeptical of the best case emissions reductions coming out of industry, the other factors around this would still lead you to come to the conclusion that this is not a good idea. So how come the big push for sustainable aviation fuels? As most of you will know, in 2015, the world's governments in Paris at the COP conference committed to net zero emissions worldwide by 2050. Airline trade associations and airlines themselves in the years following also committed to net zero emissions by 2050. And they don't have a lot of options here. Battery electric aircraft will probably continue to be just too heavy for anything other than small aircraft and short haul flights, through mid-century and probably into the second half of this century and perhaps permanently. And straight hydrogen, another fuel source that's often talked about, it would require the redesign of planes, engines, fueling systems, etc. So between now and 2050, really the only option for aviation is sustainable aviation fuel. But I will make the case that it is not a very good option at all. So there are many types of sustainable aviation fuel, and this makes it different from current fuels. Currently, there's only one feedstock, crude oil, and there's only one production process, oil refining. But with SAF, there are dozens and dozens, and depending how you subdivide them, perhaps hundreds of different feedstocks. And there is at least 8 production processes. So when you combine all those feedstocks with those production processes, you get literally hundreds of combinations and variations, permutations. But in order to cut through that clutter and make this understandable, you can really kind of reduce this down to thinking about 4 main types of SAF. Type 1 is SAF produced from crops, from corn, soybeans, and canola, and a very limited quantity of cooking oil. I'll return to that in a minute. That's a bit of a distraction. These are the near-term fuels. These are fuels produced from feedstocks and with processes that look a lot like current biofuels for cars and trucks, that look a lot like ethanol and biodiesel and renewable diesel production. So that's the near-term SAF from crops. Perhaps in the medium term, and this is much talked about in SAF circles and will actually, if it comes to pass, be the main source for SAFs. That's from residues, so straw, wheat straw, for instance, corn stover, the stalks of corn and the husks, and some forest waste. These are the long-awaited cellulosic fuels that we've heard, those of us who have been around the biofuel circles for 20 or 30 years. These cellulosic fuels have been coming for a long time, and they're still not here. But the proposal is that a lot of SAF would come from those cellulosic sources like straw, corn stover, and forest waste. Type 3 is related, but a little bit different. This is from purpose-grown energy crops, from trees and grasses, most of that grown on farmland, again, cellulosic, another medium-term fuel. And then there's type 4. Type 4 is what we call electrofuels. It goes by a lot of names, power to liquids, e-fuels, etc. And these are fuels made from renewable energy as an energy input, and then water as a hydrogen donor, and carbon dioxide as a donor of carbon. And the renewable energy is used to fuse the hydrogen and the carbon into a liquid hydrocarbon fuel. These are very, very long-term and perhaps speculative fuels. So just a little more detail. Type 3 SAF from purpose-grown energy crops. The grasses that are often mentioned are switchgrass and miscanthus, the trees, poplars or willows, and they'd probably be coppiced, so they'd be cut. The trees would be cut close to the ground and then allowed to grow back in a bushy form and then cut again, and they grow back in a bushy form. This kind of tree coppicing was one of the ways that people produced biomass for charcoal and iron smelting before they went to coal. Most of these energy crops will be grown on farmland. Don't imagine them in forest land. They'd mostly be grown on farmland. So type 4 is electrofuels. I'll just walk through this, but before I do, I'll just note, essentially, this is a proposal to run entropy backwards, to unburn fuel, to take the downstream combustion products and put energy back into them in order to create combustible fuels, liquid fuels, out of what would otherwise be exhaust. So they're going to try and run entropy backwards. So I'll just highlight here, there's an energy input into this system, renewable electricity from wind or solar or maybe hydroelectricity. That's used to split water via electrolysis, and that gives you your hydrogen source. And then more electricity is sent over here into capturing CO2, perhaps from direct air capture. So the question is, are electrofuels scalable? Are they real, or are they a distraction? Because in some ways, the electrofuels is kind of the get out of jail free card for SAF. Anyone who thinks about SAF for a while and thinks about producing all of this fuel from farmland quickly realizes that's going to be a big, big problem. But the promise in the future is that we can produce it from renewable electricity, water, and air, and thus there's no real feedstock limitations. The problem we have here is the scale-up problem. As SAF makers try and scale up production, they're going to need a lot of clean electricity, a lot of green hydrogen, and they're going to be scaling up their demands for clean electricity and green hydrogen at exactly the same time. A lot of other sectors are doing the same thing, and they're going to run into a real supply shortage for that clean electricity and that green hydrogen. And it's worth looking at just how much of those things SAF production would need. At the bottom of this slide is a quote from the US Department of Energy, and they estimate that if you tried to produce the 2050 SAF supply for the United States from electrofuels, you'd need a quantity of electricity that's about 85% as large as all of the total current US electricity generation. And just to be clear, that's total generation. That's not generation from renewables. You'd need to build out an electrical generation system that's about 85% as big as all the generation supplying the United States now. So these are very, very large quantities of energy needed. So I would offer this conclusion for your consideration. Electrofuels are probably too good to be true. They're probably not real. They'll always be tremendously energy inefficient because reversing entropy takes a lot of energy. They'll probably never be cost competitive. The industry itself says in the medium term and maybe the long term, they'll be 3 to 4 times as costly as fossil fuel. They're probably a distraction, and what that means is SAFs are likely to remain biofuels. You can think of them as farmland sourced agri-fuels and not get distracted by thinking of electrofuels. So how much SAF do we need? Some quotes here. If you look at the literature, the projections to 2050, people talk about 2.5-fold increases in the amount of flying. Airbus and Boeing are talking about delivering 40,000 new aircraft between 2023 and 2043. And the US Department of Energy says, and I'll quote, demand for jet fuel is expected to more than double by 2050 and triple by 2070. So the problem the aviation sector has is they need a lot of fuel now, and they're increasing that amount of fuel very, very rapidly. So it's going to be very, very difficult to scale up SAF production to meet that demand. Here's another way of looking at the same thing. This is a graph I produced, starts in 1930. So there's about 90 years of actual data. You can see the COVID dip in the number of passenger kilometers there. And then you can see projections for 2030 and 2050. And the consensus for 2050, there's multiple people are projecting flying volumes of about 22 trillion passenger kilometers for 2050. And that's about double where we are now, more than double. We're at about 9 trillion passenger kilometers per year now, and they're projecting about 22 trillion passenger kilometers by 2050. So very rapid increase in the amount of flying. So much SAF is needed. The consensus projection is that we'll need 2/3 of a trillion liters by 2050 and more than 1 trillion liters by 2070. And that's not a typo. Those aren't billions, those are trillions. About 1 trillion liters of fuel by 2070 every year. So what would be the feedstocks for SAF? This is a graph from multiple US departments led by the US Department of Energy. You might have seen this report. It's called the Billion Ton Report. They revise this every few years. And this is a graph showing where the United States might get 1 billion tons of biomass per year. It's US data. We don't have an equally detailed projection for Canada. But I would suggest if we had the data for Canada, it would look much the same. You can kind of think of this as a North American projection. So you'll see, first of all, that most of the biomass is to come from agriculture, not forest land. The portion coming from agriculture is about 10 times larger than what is expected to come from forestry. You'll see there the green oval. That's what will come from agricultural residues, so straw, corn stover, corn husks, etc. And you'll see those blue ovals. That's what would come from energy crops. And remember, those energy crops are going to be grown on farmland, and they will compete for farmland with food crops. They'll displace food crops. In this scenario from the US Department of Energy, they're talking tens of millions of acres used to grow those energy crops. And I just want to highlight one other thing. If you spend much time looking at sustainable aviation fuel, you'll see people talking about using waste oil, etc. The oil that comes out of McDonald's French fryers. And I'll just highlight here that little square FOG, FOG, fats, oil, and grease. That's about how much the US projects would come out of waste oil, a tiny, tiny fraction compared to what they're expecting to get from agriculture. So just to give a sense of the scale here, let's do a thought experiment. Let's ask how much land would be needed to produce the 2050 SAF supply if it all came from crops, from corn, soy, and canola. And let me underscore, this is a thought experiment. No one is suggesting that we should do this. The industry does not say that the entire 2050 SAF supply should come from crops, from corn, soy, and canola. But thinking about how much land would be needed to do so helps us understand just how big this demand is upon our land base. So the amount of SAF needed in 2050, I said 2/3 of 1 trillion liters, that's about 400 million tons. To produce that from crops would require about 2.1 billion tons of corn, soy, and canola feedstock per year. You can get about 1 ton per acre, so you'd need about 2.1 billion acres. 2.1 billion acres to produce those crops. That's 21 times the cropland area of Canada. You need 21 Canadas or about 5 US cropland areas to produce that. So it immediately raises a question, should we attempt to produce even a fraction of the SAF supply from crops? Because even if you produced, say, 10%, that'd be 2 times the cropland area of Canada. And I think a key question for policymakers and for everyone is what would be the impact of producing even a small amount of SAF from crops? In our report, we suggest that if you think about those impacts, you would come to see the acronym SAF as standing for Sacrificing Affordable Food. The food price impacts of the global SAF mega project would be far larger than those we saw in the post-COVID inflation. So let's do another thought experiment. Clearly, we can't produce the global SAF supply from crops. What about from biomass? What about from straw and corn stover, purpose-grown energy crops, poplars, willows, grasses, etc.? Well, to produce that much SAF, we'd need about 7 billion tons of biomass per year globally. But there are only about 4 billion acres of cropland globally. So we'd need about 2 tons of agricultural residue and energy crops from every acre on Earth, every acre of cropland on Earth every year. And that's just not possible. And below, I'll talk a little bit about BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and how that would further increase the amount of biomass we'd have to take from every acre. So what are the effects on soil carbon sequestration, and agricultural emissions? Soil carbon levels, soil organic matter is really key to soil health. The more organic matter, the more soil carbon you have, the spongier that ground is, the more it can absorb water, hold that water when the rains fail and the droughts come, and provide that to the crops, or soak up water when the rains are heavy and prevent flooding. The amount of carbon and soil organic matter in the ground is really a function of two factors. One, the inputs in the form of crop biomass. Big crops produce more biomass and more carbon going into the soil. So the inputs are one side of the equation, and then the outputs are the other. The amount of carbon consumed and respired by soil microorganisms as CO2. So really, you can just think of it as lots of carbon going in. Soils build carbon, less carbon going in. They build it more slowly, or they release it. Thus, removing straw, removing corn stover, removing large amounts of biomass will impact soil carbon health, impact it adversely, and it'll also slow soil carbon sequestration, something we're counting on to help mitigate climate change. This is a graph from Canada's National Inventory Report. What happened in 2021 and 2022 was kind of a natural experiment that illustrates what happens potentially if you remove a lot of biomass for SAF. In 2021, we had a drought. The crop was smaller. The biomass inputs into the soil were smaller. And because of those smaller biomass inputs, the amount of carbon leaving the soil exceeded the amount going in. And you'll see in the graph in 2022, we had a large release of soil organic carbon. Most years between 1990 and 2021, the carbon is moving from the atmosphere into the soil. But in 2022, as a result of the 2021 drought, we had a large release. And important to understand is a 30 to 50% reduction in the tonnage of carbon going into the soil didn't lead to a 30 or 50% reduction in soil carbon sequestration. Instead, it led to a complete reduction, 100% reduction in soil carbon sequestration, and beyond that, an actual soil carbon release. So it's quite clear that removing large amounts of biomass for SAF would do something akin to what we're seeing in this graph, and slow or even reverse soil carbon gains and soil carbon sequestration. So that's soil carbon sequestration. What about agricultural greenhouse gas emissions? As many of you'll know, the main driver of increasing agricultural emissions isn't energy use, it's nitrogen use. And sustainable aviation fuel production, either for crops or for energy crops, will require more nitrogen fertilizer use, and that increased nitrogen fertilizer use will drive up agricultural emissions. One farmer said to me that if we pursue this path, if we try and produce the global aviation fuel supply from farmland, it really vetoes agricultural emissions reduction. It makes it impossible to imagine that in 2050, farmers will be producing lower emissions than they are now. So what we have is a purported solution to aviation emissions, but that creates a big problem for agricultural emissions. And just a little bit of background on that. The graph on the left is nitrogen fertilizer use in Canada over the last 33 years. And the graph on the right is agricultural emissions. And you can see the green section in the middle. Those are emissions from nitrogen fertilizer production and use. You can see that green band in the middle is going is getting wider, and that's largely responsible for driving that top line upward. More nitrogen fertilizer leading to higher greenhouse gas emissions, and that will be driven in the wrong direction if we attempt to maximize our production in order to supply the market for SAF. So these fuels create an agricultural emissions problem. Do they solve the aviation emissions problem? So what we are trying to make policymakers aware of, and what others are making policymakers aware of, is that net zero is not zero. The aviation sector is committed to net zero, but that's not zero emissions. And this is a graph from Transport Canada showing a couple of decades of actual emissions from Canadian aviation and then projections out to 2050. And you can see actual emissions are about 22 million tons CO2e per year now. And with the projected increase in flying, you can see that they go to above 40 million tons. So again, we see this doubling, but that's not the trajectory they say that will follow. Things like efficiency and SAF will bring those emissions down. And you can see how that curve goes down on the right-hand side, down to about 12 million tons, about where we were in 2005, but that's not zero. We're going to go down from about 22 down to 12, about a 50% reduction, but there's no scenario there that goes down to zero. And I'll just highlight one factor here over on the right, what they call out of sector reductions. That's offsets, that's emissions trading, that's the airline industry going out and paying money in carbon markets to buy offsets from somewhere else. And a lot of industries are sort of planning on doing the same thing. They're planning on reducing their emissions, but not bringing them anywhere near zero, and they'll go out and buy offsets somewhere. But the question we have is it likely with all of those industries seeking to buy offsets in 2050, is it likely that the supply of high quality, credible offsets are going to be there? And we don't think they are. We think that the demand for those offsets in order to sort of square that circle and actually get people to net zero, that the demand for those offsets will dramatically exceed the supply. We can't think of a sector that will actually be in a position to be selling offsets in 2050. Most will be looking to buy them. Here's the other problem. Only a fraction of the warming effects from aviation come from the combustion of fossil fuels and engines. This is a quote from a report, a journal article last year in Atmospheric Chemistry. And the authors point out that the combustion emissions account for only 1/3 of the overall radiative forcing, the overall warming effect. And fully 2/3 of those warming effects come from non-CO2 components, such as contrails, nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, and stratospheric water vapor emissions. So even if you could find a perfect SAF that had no life cycle emissions and produce it in quantities such that it fueled 100% of aviation, you will only have dealt with 1/3 of the warming effects of aviation. The other 2/3 are left unmitigated. And because aviation is expanding so rapidly, that 2/3 that you haven't really touched with SAF is just going to get larger and larger, such that best case scenarios for SAF still leave you with more warming effects, more radiative forcing in 2050 than you have now, because aviation is planning on doubling and tripling the amount of flying we do, and hence doubling and tripling these 2/3 of the warming effects from aviation. So the big question is, at scale, are SAFs even possible? Is it even conceivable that we can meet the demand for 2050? So just to go over some of these numbers again, the fuel volumes would be approaching 1 trillion liters per year. The number of production facilities needed, and there's almost no facilities now, The number needed by 2050 is between 3,400 and 6,700 total production facilities. So if you take the middle of that estimate, you're at about 5,000 production facilities needed. There's only 10,000 days between now and the end of 2050. So if you need 5,000 production facilities, you need to finish and bring online one production facility every 2 days. And you need to keep that pace going for 25 years. Now, those production facilities are going to be very expensive. The industry, IATA, the trade association for the airlines, estimates that it could cost up to $14 trillion Canadian. And they're very clear, airlines do not generate that kind of profit, those kinds of margins, and that most of the money for that, most of that $14 trillion is going to have to come from governments and taxpayers in order to decarbonize aviation. And just to end this slide with a quote, just to kind of underscore some of the points above, IATA itself says that between now and 2050, we'll need a 1,000-fold increase in the production of SAF. And if you break that in terms of plant size of an average of 50 to 70,000 tons per year, you'll need 300 plants per year. And I said one every 2 days. They're talking about nearly one a day. And they've got to maintain that production, the construction pace for 25 years. I don't think they're going to make it. So one question I often put to people who are proposing best case scenarios around SAF is, have they heard of BECCS? Have they heard of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage? Some of you'll know bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is negative emission electricity. If you imagine a thermal generating plant, maybe burning coal right now, if that plant instead burnt biomass, the biomass would capture carbon as it photosynthesizes and grows. You'd burn that biomass in a BECCS plant, and then you'd capture the carbon. So you'd have negative emissions and you'd have electricity. Two things you want. Now, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their scenarios around 2 degrees, certainly 1.5, but many of the scenarios around 2 degrees, they project that we'll overshoot safe atmospheric emissions concentrations, and then we'll have to draw down the carbon out of the atmosphere later, that we'll need to deploy negative emissions technologies in order to draw down carbon, in order to keep the atmosphere stable and habitable, well, to keep the atmosphere conducive to ongoing civilization in the modern economy, say. These negative emission technologies are thus kind of built into the IPCC scenarios. They're non-optional. So something like BECCS is likely in the future, and it's needed if we think we're going to meet these climate targets. The problem that we have is that BECCS and SAFs draw on exactly the same feedstocks: forest residue, crop residue, energy crops. So to the 7 billion tons per year of biomass that we need for SAF, we need another 8 billion tons for BECCS, 15 billion in total, about 4 tons from every acre of cropland on Earth every year. A lot of farmers struggle now to take 1 ton off. 4 tons on every acre of cropland every year from a cropland base that's also trying to feed us. It's just not possible. So let's look at the big picture, the context for BECCS. You know, we've talked about BECCS and SAF, but those aren't the only 2 things we're trying to do. So we look at all of the different plans for our farmland base in the 21st century. Many sectors are looking to farmland to solve their problems. So here's all the things we're going to try and do over the coming decades. We're going to try and feed the hundreds of millions of people that are hungry today. We're going to try and make progress on world hunger. And we're going to add 1 billion or 2 billion or more people to the global population. And we're going to extend animal-based diets to a lot of those people, to the growing middle class, to people that prefer to consume their calories as meat and dairy rather than lentils and and wheat, and producing those calories from animal products takes more land than it does producing them from grain and pulses, etc. And we're going to produce biomaterials to replace plastics, and we're going to produce more land-sourced fibers, cotton, etc., to clothe more people and to produce and to replace biofibers. And we're going to produce all those billions of tons for BECCS and billions more for SAF. And we're going to find land to plant trees to draw down CO2. We've heard about the very ambitious billions of trees we plan to plant here in Canada. We're going to do all the preceding while attempting to reduce nitrogen fertilizer use, because we're already beyond planetary boundaries when it comes to nitrogen fertilizer use. And we're going to do all of this even as climate impacts hit harder and harder, making it very difficult to maintain agricultural production in many years in many places. And we're going to do all of the preceding while attempting to use less farmland, because the expansion of the farmland base and cutting forests and incursions into jungles and grasslands is one of the things that's driving extinctions. And when you look at that list, it seems unlikely that we're going to be able to do all those things. Another way of looking at this in terms of the big picture, this is a graph that was generously contributed by David Hughes to our report. And what David's pointing out here is the last 200 years have been this tremendous transition from a world fueled by biomass to a world fueled by fossil fuels, such that today 94% of the energy supply is coming from fossil fuels and just 6% from biomass. And SAF and BECCS and all of these other concurrent projects would have us believe that we can reverse this trend, that we can revert to a biomass fueled civilization. And I would invite you to consider that probably isn't possible. So another way of thinking about this in the big picture is to ask the question, are humans already taking too much from the earth and its farmland? And when you think about what we're taking from the farmland, this graph helps us really picture just how extreme our demands are. This is based on data by Yinan Baron, Ron Milo, and others, and they built upon earlier analyses by Vaclav Smil, by Bernovsky, and others. And what they did is they estimated the mass, the weight of wild animals, livestock, and humans on Earth at 3 different periods. So the bar on the left is 50,000 years ago, before humans radiated out from Africa and caused megafauna extinctions in Australia and elsewhere. The bar in the middle is 11,000 years ago, before agriculture, and then on the right you have the situation today. So 50,000 years ago, of course, there were no livestock, and the mass of humans is so small that the blue bar is not visible in the graph. The same is true 11,000 years ago, no livestock, and the mass of humans, the number of humans was tiny compared to the mass of wild animals. But look where we are today. Humans and our livestock dominate the earth. We and our livestock outweigh all the wild animals 33 to 1. And we've really forced wild animals into sort of a remnant population, and we've taken most of their habitat for our own, and that's how we manage to so massively multiply the number of humans in our livestock. And I think what we're seeing in that graph is humans and their food animals already taking up too much space on the earth, consuming too much of the earth's biomass, too much of our NPP, net primary productivity, etc. And sustainable aviation fuel is another massive taking from the earth's land base, from the biomass, from the NPP, more for humans. So in addition to this food supply demand, we're going to add a huge fuel demand. A key question is just whether the sustainable part of sustainable aviation fuel is in any way justifiable. Are these in any way sustainable? This is a graph many of you will have seen before. Johann Steffen, Will Rockstrom, and others did several reports over the last couple decades around the idea of planetary boundaries and safe operating space for planet Earth. This is from the most recent one. And the green area in the middle shows the safe operating space. You can think about that as sustainable. And then those wedges radiating out in increasingly angry colors of yellow and orange and red and purple, that shows our breaches, our transgressions of planetary boundaries. And just starting at the bottom there in the kind of the 6 or 7 o'clock position and going clockwise, you see biogeochemical flows, nitrogen and phosphorus. They're already far, far outside of the sustainable space, and SAF will make that worse. It will make them more unsustainable. So the marginal additions, the incremental additions of SAF will occur far outside the sustainable space when it comes to nitrogen and phosphorus flows. Freshwater, same thing. Biofuel production requires a lot of water. The extraction of freshwater is already outside the sustainable space, and SAF, that's where SAF will happen at that margin. So it will happen in the unsustainable space. Land system change, forest clearing, destruction of grassland, same thing. And moving up into the 10 or 11 o'clock position there, we have destruction of ecosystems and loss of biodiversity. And again, those are far outside of sustainable limits, and SAF will drive more land conversion, more habitat loss, etc. So it's arguable that this is a misnomer. Sustainable aviation fuels are just misnamed. They're perhaps farmland sourced aviation fuels, but the word sustainable probably shouldn't be applied. I've showed you that graph before, but I think it's probably the most important one in this presentation. We as humans and in our agricultural systems are taking a tremendous amount from the earth and probably foisting onto that farmland area, onto the land area of the earth. The requirement to fuel our jets is probably just going a bit too far. So just a couple on my final slide here before I wrap up, just a few recommendations. We would say to government, don't evaluate the impact of sustainable aviation fuel based on the first liter or the next liter. Think about what this looks like if it goes to scale. What will be the sustainability and environmental impacts of the last liter, the trillionth liter? Think about this in 2050 as producing 2/3 or 1 trillion liters per year. What will be the impacts there? And going further, evaluate SAF in the context of all the other demands we're about to place on our farmland, feeding billions more people, producing biomaterials, producing biomass for BECCS, doing all of this as the climate becomes more inhospitable, doing all of this while we try and use less nitrogen. Next thing we'd say is don't funnel public funds to SAF to subsidize air travel. This project needs trillions and trillions of dollars, and it's very clear from the industry that they're going to keep coming back to governments wanting more and more money because they can't internally finance this. Instead, we should invest in transport options that can really be zero emission. Trains powered by renewable electricity, buses powered by renewable electricity, active transport. Finally, call the airlines bluff. They claim that eventually they're going to transition to electrofuels. Have them do that now. Don't invest trillions in biofuels plants that will become stranded assets as biomass supplies run out. Go directly to electrofuels and pass those costs of flying on to the flying public. Last thing, any plan to double or triple air travel is not compatible with a serious adult understanding of the climate crisis. It's just irresponsible to follow airlines down their trajectory of doubling and tripling air travel. So thanks for your time. All the details, all the citations and source notes are in our report. But most importantly, There are dozens and dozens of quotes from the airline industry themselves underscoring many of the points I've made, talking about the 1,000-fold increase they'll need, all the biomass, et cetera, the trillions of dollars that'll be required to do this. And this report is just one of many that the NFU has done over the last few years, tackling the farm crisis and the climate crisis, evaluating the emissions coming out of agriculture, the Imagine If report, a very positive, forward-looking, optimistic look at how we could move to a very, very low emission food system. Another report on agricultural greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. And finally, one on nitrogen fertilizer, just how critical it is to feeding the global population, but the many environmental problems we have if we overuse it. So thanks for your time today. And with that, I will stop sharing and turn it back to Dave.
Well, thank you very much, Darren. That was absolutely fascinating. I hope we'll engender a few questions from our audience. I have 5 at the moment. I want to ask one of my own first, and I've got Art Hunter on deck. As part of that discussion, I'm going to say something further because I had a second question that's actually related to what Art wants to investigate. So I was wondering if you could tell us whether the National Farmers Union has discussed carrying capacity for Canada. Could we feed 100 million people by the end of the century? Could we feed even the 40 million people we have now going forward toward the end of the century, given that we are facing a lot of changes in our environment and we appear to be facing major changes in our trading relationships? What will happen if we cannot import food?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, clearly there's some things we have to import. We have to import coffee, say, and probably pineapples. You could theoretically produce them here under greenhouse conditions, but it wouldn't be feasible. Second thing I'll say though is we could produce a lot of our food here. When you look at what actually fills your shopping basket, a lot of it's meats, grains, dairy products, etc. So, you know, outside of tea and coffee and a few of those things, it's amazing if you figured it out in terms of the tonnage, we could produce a lot of food here and we could produce a fairly balanced diet. But of course, we choose to import a lot of things. But I think implicit in your question is just, you know, could we produce enough calories? Could we use the Canadian land base to produce enough calories and a diverse enough diet to support the population we have and a larger one? I think you've discussed this a lot amongst yourself, and I think you'll recognize there's just a lot of variables. The first variable is how much nitrogen are you willing to use? If you took the synthetic nitrogen out of the global food supply, the global food production system now, you'd have a very difficult time. If you are willing to crank up nitrogen use, you can probably crank up food production. But as you know, the impacts both on climate, biodiversity, and the environment are very high if you raise that. Second thing, are we going to go down this path with sustainable aviation fuel? Are we going to devote a very significant fraction of our farmland base to producing fuel for vacation jets? If we do that, feeding people gets much, much harder. And the last thing is, what are people planning to eat? I remember going to Vaclav Smil's office a couple decades ago because he was talking about just how many people we could feed in the world. And after talking to him for a while, I realized that he was envisioning a diet that was mostly based on lentils. And, you know, if you think that people are willing and able and happy to eat that diet, you can feed one number of people and 40 million easily and probably 100. But if you think people will continue to want to eat meat and cheese and dairy products, the number is lower. So yes, we can. We can feed any number we wish, but it requires us to make some choices around diet, around other uses, and around how much nitrogen we're willing to pump into the environment, et cetera.
Thank you. I conclude, let them eat cake. Okay, so in relation to Art's question, I hope you'll cover this aspect. I was wondering whether it might be better to shift aviation fuel supply to the oceans and vats and man-made pools in which we would grow algae, which actually, strangely enough, was an undergraduate project I did in the late 1970s. Anyway, over to you, Art, and we've got Claude Butner in reserve on deck.
Okay. Yeah, well, indeed, that was the main part of my question. Of course, biomass from algae and ocean grasses and other fast-growing vegetation, both in freshwater and in seawater. But and that's really one part of the question you addressed as well during your presentation, the necessity to find other ways to travel. And I just recently traveled by train, and what an enjoyable trip. I met a businessman coming from Toronto to Ottawa, and he's taking the train because it was $200 cheaper than flying, and and I dare say far more comfortable. Yes, takes a little bit longer, but slow your life down a little bit. Clearly, one of the things that is at play here, one of these nonlinear things that come along and surprise us is, of course, is the phenomena called Trump. And he is definitely driving the world into a highly inflationary world, which means that the cost of meat and of fuel and just about everything else is going to go up, which which means that all of us are going to have to reduce our comfort and convenience and switch more to becoming vegetarians, get off dairy and what have you. And and I just want to comment that I've virtually done that for the last year or so. But that's more a comment. In terms of and to keep this all in perspective as well, the massive amount of energy required. There's the how many SMR companies? I believe it's something like 45 are on the verge now of coming out with small modular reactors that are certainly going to replace a lot of fossil fuels, and yes, possibly have other problems associated with them. But there are activities going on which are going to eat at the very base of the analysis that you put forward. And of course, as well, we've got population reduction that is definitely recognized by most folks in the field, that you want to reduce the number of people on the planet. And of course, the way things are going now, war should probably do a great deal of population reduction. It's certainly working well in Ukraine and in Russia right now. Anyway, your comments, please, on biomass from oceans and freshwaters.
Yeah, so thanks for those comments and questions. LJ fuels have been coming soon for a long time, and the problem we will have with LJ fuels is they won't be as cheap as land-based biomass, and land-based biomass will not be as cheap as crops. The market is going to drive they're going to drive the demand first toward these crops because that's the cheapest and easiest way to produce SAF. And then next, it's going to drive it toward land-based biomass. And then only thirdly, if for some reason they're pushed off of that, to LJ fuels. And the industry isn't talking about LJ fuels because they are significantly more expensive than either crops or land-based biomass. And if I could just say one thing about trains, because really, all of this stuff, whether it's electrofuels from solar and wind or electrofuels from SMRs or biofuels from LJ, none of this stuff makes nearly as much sense as trains. And North America is an outlier. The rest of the world is building trains. Europe's got them. I've been fortunate to be on some very fast trains in Europe, hundreds of kilometers per hour. China, of course, even Africa is building high-speed trains. And I just want to remind us all, and you're probably aware of it. We used to build trains in Canada between 1890 and 1918, at a time when Canada was much poorer than it is now and had much lower population densities. More or less with hand tools, we built enough railway track to cross Canada 7 times. We did that more than 100 years ago. And now it seems incredible that we would ponder building trains. But of course, that's what the rest of the world's doing. China's built 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, and they're talking about building another 30,000 kilometers on top of that, and they're helping people around Africa build networks in their own countries. So the logical thing here, if we think we have trillions of dollars to invest in SAF, and if we think most of that's coming from taxpayers, to redeploy that money into something that really can be zero emission, and that's trains.
Well, I just returned from riding business class on a train, and I would do it again in a flash. I never want to be on an airplane again. I'm all for trains, and I'll do everything to promote trains from here forward. Anyway, thank you for your comment.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for the answer, Darren. Okay, we're going to move to Claude Butner, and Richard van der Yach is on deck.
Darren, thank you so much. This is a very good presentation, very thought-provoking. My question is, very briefly, is there a good understanding of the relative sizes of global commercial aviation versus the global military aviation?
Yeah, good question. I think there is a good understanding. I don't have it. I looked briefly because the SAF numbers don't include military aviation. And I just wanted kind of a ballpark figure. And I won't get this nearly right, but aviation is, it's less than a quarter as large. Military aviation is less than a quarter as large as passenger aviation fuel use. I believe it's kind of in that ballpark, but that's not anything like a precise estimate.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we're going to Richard van der Yach, and Mike Nickerson is on deck.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Aaron. That was a great presentation. I had always thought that SAFs were going to be part of the solution, like part of the solution towards, I always feel guilty when I go flying, if we go flying anywhere on vacation. And I guess what it comes down to, and my question to you, just being very direct, is the answer then to go vegetarian and to stop flying?
Well, in reverse order, stop flying. I think you have to give people alternatives. We've because we can fly, because we can drive, we ended up with these far-flung families, and none of us never want to see our family members, that live far away. We want to see them again. And if flying is the only option, it's hard to tell people they should never fly again. So we need to give them options. We need to give them trains so they can stop flying. And in terms of vegetarianism, I don't think it's that binary. I think a lot of us in a place like Canada, myself, for instance, eat too much meat, and we eat a lot of meat we don't enjoy and that we take for granted. And I think those of us who eat as much meat as I do should eat less meat. And people in other parts of the country that eat a lot less maybe could eat a little more. and some of the land in the world is grazing land and can be grazing land, and it shouldn't be cropland. So they should graze animals there. One farmer who was completely on side on sustainability and agriculture, he just said, "Well, if you waved a magic wand and took all the meat and livestock out of Canada, a lot of that farmland would get ripped up and cropped, and somebody'd put a bunch of nitrogen fertilizer in there, and the greenhouse gas emissions might go up and not down." So there's counterfactuals to consider. But I've also heard I've heard a lot of good analyses on all parts of this. So I hope you don't think I'm equivocating. I just think it's a little more complex than just the binary of everyone should stop. Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Great, thank you. So John Hollins is on deck, assuming that his computer problem has been resolved. Mike Nickerson, we're going to go to you now.
Hi, Darren. Thank you for that. I wasn't aware really of the fossil fuel aspect of it all, or the flying aspect of it all. It makes sense that it's more than we can handle. I know you've been studying and researching sort of leading edge agricultural issues for a very long time. It predates my database. You've talked to an awful lot of people on related subjects. Have you come across any place where they're seriously considering the possibility of rejigging our culture so that we have other things to aim for besides the expansion? And notably, we're up against the advertising industry, but we've been able with that to persuade everybody to be consumers. There must be some way that we could have a different sort of culture that doesn't stress on all these levels.
Yeah, well, thanks, Mike, and good to see you here in this venue. And I think you've thought more about this question of culture and myths and the stories we tell each other and ourselves than I have. But just to say, the National Farmers Union is talking about limits and the need for limits on what we demand from the earth, limits on how much fertilizer we jam into it in an attempt to push ever more food out, limits as a form of wisdom. So I think from that point of view, the culture of endless growth, the culture of consumerism, the culture of, just foisting endless new demands onto the farmland base and the biosphere, we're certainly talking about that.
Would they consider more fun, less stuff as a viable direction?
Sorry, Mike, say that again.
More fun, less stuff?
More fun, less stuff?
As a general direction?
I think we would. I mean, certainly in conversations that comes up a lot. I had one person say that the solution to the climate crisis is just to remind everyone what it was like to live in Paris in the 1960s. People had intellectual conversations, they had time, they had poetry and romance, and they did all of that with probably 1/10 the fossil fuel input and emissions output that it takes me to have a so-called good life in Canada today.
Thank you.
This is going to be news to all the people who want to be snowbirds and escape Canada's winters. Okay, I got Peter McKinnon on deck, and we're going now to John Hollins.
Thank you. I love to listen to your talk. You deal with the whole system, not just a bit of it, and that's the business that the Club of Rome and the Canadian affiliate is in. You have a compelling story to tell, in my opinion. Well, you certainly pushed me around, and but so I sort of have two questions. One is, have you been able to connect with governmental audiences, federally or provincially? That's the business that the National Farmers Union is in, so you would have a far better chance at that than we in CACOR would have. But have you been able to get your story over to either bureaucrats or ministers?
Sorry, I was expecting a second question there. I'll answer this one.
Just go.
Yeah. So we have
there.
a meeting. We have a meeting with the provincial government next month in March. We're sort of at the beginning of this. We just came out with our report in November. And it took a while to develop the analysis, and it's taking a while too to sort of get on the government radar. But yeah, that is what we are trying to do. We are trying to get in early to government before they start flowing massive amounts of money into this, because once they do, it's very, very hard to get them to turn around. But we're already seeing millions flowing here in Canada into various biofuels production facilities, and we want them to understand that this is a system that will keep asking for money year after year after year. The demands from the SAF sector will just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they should, before they go down that path, look at their other options.
Do you have a partner in the United States? Has there been any approach along these lines to the federal government in USA, let's say pre-Trump? Because the story you're telling suggests that the folks who are pushing this are basically Trumpian in the way they think.
No, I wouldn't say that they're Trumpian. This predates Trump, and it's well developed in Europe. It's in terms of allies in the United States, we're trying to build that. There aren't a lot of analyses. When I set off to write a critical analysis of sustainable aviation fuel, I assume I would just get the other 10 critical analyses and read them and sort of learn from that, and then put our particular spin on it as a farm organization. And there aren't any. Read our report, because it's one of the only ones out there. It's based on a lot of quotes from the industry, and we're very, very certain that we got this one right. But what's really surprising is just how the critical analysis isn't out there yet.
Thank you. Come back again next year.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. That's a good endorsement, Darren. Okay, I've got Jeff Passmore on deck with what may actually be a comment that turns into a discussion between you two, and we're going to go now to Peter McKinnon.
Thank you, Dave. Darren, excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. I also have talked to the Club of Rome here before on the poly crisis. So it's a subject that I actually am deeply involved in. I have two questions, one for the comment. They're both relating to the poly crisis, and I'll just read what I wrote in the posting here. With respect to planetary boundaries, the theme of atmospheric aerosols is not yet quantified, as you know. Thus, can you comment on the impact of agriculture on and in the time frames you are speaking about, including, of course, with respect to SAF, in terms of affecting the atmospheric aerosols? Do you see agriculture being a contributor to that? I know we haven't measured it and quantified it yet in a totality, but do you think agriculture is a player in this game, creating aerosols?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to have to say pass on that one, Peter. That's not something I've studied. I don't know. Maybe you know that better than I do.
Well, I would think that there is a contribution, and so maybe we could talk offline. But that's interesting. Thank you. My second point, which is a comment with a question following it, and just read on it. It's something you've raised and several others, I think, here too. With more nitrogen in the agricultural system, I'm suggesting with more nitrogen in the agricultural system, it will further stress the pollution of fresh water. And this is a conundrum with respect to feeding the world while constraining the poly crisis. Do you have any comment on this conundrum? How do we balance these?
Yeah, so we've done this detailed analysis of sustainable aviation fuel, but about a year and a half earlier, we did a very detailed analysis on nitrogen fertilizer, and I invite you to have a look at that. And yeah, we do look at all of the ways that nitrogen misses its targets. We put a quantity in, and most of it misses the target, which is the grain. And whether it's leaching into water, or volatilizing into air and then being translocated and maybe deposited back onto land or water. Yeah, the more of this we use, the more ends up in water, and also just other ecosystems.
Mm-hmm.
And you've probably seen work that shows that we've doubled or tripled the amount of nitrogen coursing through terrestrial ecosystems on Earth compared to pre-industrial times. It's one of the largest human interventions into the planetary chemistry and mechanics that you could imagine. So it's a huge issue. And again, all of this SAF requires more nitrogen fertilizer.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much. You've drawn my conclusion to be that indeed there is some kind of impact there. And I just might point out, because it's already been mentioned, I think, by Art and a couple of others, that of course there's another polycrisis that's going on, and that's the polycrisis of governance. And so we have the environmental polycrisis and the governance polycrisis all at the same time, and we're not being able to resolve some of these problems in the physical world that you've been talking about simply because of the other polycrisis. That's just a comment. Over to you, Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to get Claude Buhner on deck, and Jeff Passmore, we're going to go to you now. And Claude is going to be our last question unless somebody comes up with something else he wants to discuss.
Thanks, Dave. I hope I don't disappoint you because you suggested that maybe we would get into an animated discussion, Darren and I. But first of all, I put a link in the chat on the Council on Sustainable Aviation Fuels Accountability that has been established just for people's information. But I just had a couple of thoughts. By the way, a lot of material there, Darren, and I noted down your email address. I'll send you a note separately. I manage Canada's annual Industrial Bioeconomy Business Conference called Scaling Up, and I think you could make an interesting contributor to that conference in terms of a potential speaker, but we'll talk about that offline. The US billion-ton study, I don't think is directly comparable to Canada. I put that information in the chat. I think that we have way less agriculture land than they have. Actually, they have about 5 times more agriculture land than Canada has, something like 900 million acres versus 150 million. And then we're fairly comparable on forests. I mean, I had to switch back between acres and hectares, but we're 365 million hectares, they're 300. So I think we would, if you were to draw a similar picture as the US billion-ton study, you'd probably find way more contribution from forestry than the US one does, and less simply because of the lack of farmland, way less from agriculture. I will say that the chief forester for the county of Renfrew, which is the largest county in the province of Ontario, spoke at Scaling Up last year, and she was echoing what a lot of other foresters I've spoken to have said. And by the way, she considers herself a tree hugger. She used to tell her dad that you couldn't cut down a single tree, and now she's the chief forester for Renfrew County and understands the whole notion of forestry way better. Please increase demand for low-grade wood. We have to do something about low-grade wood. There's no sawmills have closed all across the country. Pulp and paper mills have closed. We need the increased demand for forest products to help prevent forest fires. So that was one of her key messages. And then just parenthetically, Art, I've been taking the train back and forth between Toronto and Ottawa, and Toronto and Montreal and Ottawa, and I completely agree with you. It's an absolute pleasure. And the bar is pretty low, but even the food is better than Air Canada. Okay, so that's just a comment, Darren. You can respond or not as you see fit. I mean, there are lots of other things you said that I would love to comment on. I thought you did a great job of going through types 1, 2, 3, 4. I really liked your comment about don't focus on the first or second leader, focus on the last leader. I think that's true of so many aspects of paths that we're going down. And of course, it's not just sustainable aviation fuels that's not net zero. It's across the economy that where net zero is not zero.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Jeff. And I agree. Yeah, certainly the mix of forest versus farmland in Canada is going to be different. And I lamented that we didn't have anything nearly that detailed for Canada. So I think you're right. I think it wouldn't look exactly the same in Canada, but in our report, we do have a graph from CSAF, the Canadian Coalition on Sustainable Aviation Fuel, and it's from their CSAF roadmap. And I just brought it up here on my screen. And the vast majority of what they see as a feedstock is ag residue, and it's about twice as big as wood residue. So I think you're right. The imbalance isn't as big as in the US, but it's still pretty big. Like 2/3 or 3/4 are thinking is going to come from ag residue and ethanol, and just 1/3 or so from wood residue. But you're not incorrect at all in saying Canada with more forest and less farmland would look a little different in that billion-ton report.
It doesn't solve the problem, of course. I'm just pointing that out. It doesn't solve the problem that you pointed out, which is that there's going to be way more demand for biomass than there is biomass, whether we're talking forestry or agriculture. So, it doesn't solve that. But I just wanted to make that observation. So,
Great, thank you.
Actually, on the billion-ton study, just so you know, I spend a lot of time working in Washington, and when you talk to the people at USDOE and USDA, and you ask them, so is that based on boots on the ground? And because it's now 1.3 billion tons, even though they still call it the billion-ton study, or is it based on modeling? And of course, you know what the answer is. It's all based on modeling. The minute you get on the ground, you find out that there's way less biomass than you thought there was at the 30,000 foot level.
Great. Okay, thank you. So just before I move to Claude Butner, Meg Sears has agreed to ask a question, so she's going to be on deck. The last bit of that discussion reminded me of one of the scenes in one of the novels in the Great Disruption series that I published, where they're actually making biodiesel out of people because there's nothing else to make it from.
Well, that would be the answer. That would be the answer to Richard's question. Do we have to become vegetarians and stop flying? And of course, the best thing we could do for the environment would be to die. But don't get cremated because that consumes too much energy and too many emissions.
Most important thing is not to breed.
That's
Well,
Charlie Hall for anybody who didn't notice.
Hi, Charlie. Greetings.
Hi, Darren. First time I've seen your face, but we've been connected for a long time.
No, that's not the case. I was down in Montana at your shindig there a few years ago.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Charlie had too many beers. Doesn't remember your face. Okay. Claude Butner, followed by Meg Sears, and then we'll wrap it up. Is Claude there? Hello. Okay. Claude's not there at the moment. So Claude had this to say, if I can go back. Okay. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about your industry presentation to the SAF group.
Yeah, so it was shorter. I think it was just a 25-minute presentation. The Sustainable Aviation Futures North America conference took place in Houston, Texas in October. And it was really a meeting of industry types. So the fuel producers were there, the airlines were there, even some of the aircraft manufacturers were there. And I just wanted to attend to learn more about it because I was still in the sort of research phase. And in conversations, I got an invitation to present. And I told them I'd have some critical questions. I didn't want to I wanted them to be clear on what I was going to do, and went down and said a lot of the same things I said here today, that when you look at the demands on farmland for BECCS, for feeding people, when you look at the amount of fertilizer that's going to require, when you look at the extinction crisis we've already triggered by using as much land as we are, that this just wasn't a very good idea, that this just wasn't sustainable in any way. And there was a lot of shock looks on people's faces, but then a lot of people came up quietly in the hallways afterward and said they're glad that someone said out loud what a lot of people were wondering about quietly to themselves, that, can you really, in addition to all the things we're doing on Earth, can you really foist onto the global farmland base the requirement to fuel all the jets?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. Okay, thank you. So Meg Sears, we're going over to you, and we're going to have a follow-up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Darren. It's what you're saying is really, really important. I think that we've got way too much magical thinking that's been going on for decades about how if we can just tweak our efficiencies or whatever, then we're going to be able to carry on, which clearly we can't. And I did put a link earlier in the chat to Paul Martin, not the politician, is one physicist and engineer who has done a lot on hydrogen, which is one example of some of the magical thinking, and what you're talking about today is another very serious example. And so what I would like to see is, kind of the quickest path, and what you're doing today is really important for that, to recognizing these limits, because we can't carry on going exceeding all these limits of the the global boundaries, and have an honest statement about, there's always, people are always saying, well, if we use a slightly different technology, if we use hydrogen, if we use better efficiency, etc., what are the realistic possibilities for improving the efficiency, all the parameters to really optimize, in this case, sustainable aviation fuels. And I would say that I used to fly gliders, and that my husband competed twice for Canada in the International Gliding Championships. And so there are other options that sometimes people don't consider. And I would highly recommend that, although it might not be quite as reliable as Air Canada.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk of efficiency. There's been massive efficiency gains in aviation. The problem is, and I'm sure that this crowd, just about everyone's heard of the Jevons paradox. The efficiencies have been turned into lower costs, and the lower costs have been turned into higher demand, and the higher demand has driven exponential growth, and thus the amount of flying is increasing far faster than the efficiency gains. The increase in fuel use because of increasing flying is much larger than the decrease in fuel use as a result of efficiency.
Right. So that's not going to be our answer.
Right, not.
Yeah. Thanks for putting that out there.
It's interesting that offline, on other methods of communication amongst members, CACOR members have recently been discussing, lost the train of thought. Okay, let me go on. I'm going to move to Jean Doherty, who's the secretary with the board of directors for CACOR. But first I want to say one little thing. Somebody mentioned, I think it might have been Peter McKinnon, that nitrogen fertilizer would result in the contamination of fresh waters. Yes, it will do that, but we already have well over 400 dead zones in our oceans, because eventually that nitrogen makes its way to the oceans. Huge areas are now highly contaminated. The oxygen greatly diminished. And in fact, one of the things that the Americans probably don't really realize they're doing is they're turning the Gulf of Mexico into the Gulf of America. It's becoming a huge dead zone. So over to Jean.
Thank you, Dave. And Darren, thank you very much for an absolutely wonderful presentation. Very, very thorough and thoughtful. Again, everybody is looking at different issues with blinders on. And this was one of the first presentations I have witnessed in the last while where you're looking at things more holistically. And it really brings into focus the fact that, to quote Apollo 13, Houston, we have a problem. And it really is was an absolutely phenomenal presentation that you gave today, and thank you very much for that. So for those of you who are still here, I would like to say thank you very much for coming and enjoying this particular presentation and participating in our CACOR live series. If you're interested in finding this particular topic or any of the other ones that we have presented over the last few years, please go to canadiancorps.com and look at the Stay Informed section, and from there you will see, if you sign up for Stay Informed, you actually will be getting notices of all of the CACOR presentations that are being posted on our website. So if you're interested in finding out more about CACOR, the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, you can find that on our website as well. And I look forward to meeting more of you in the future. Thank you very much.